Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched The Iron Claw from 2023. Now, this is a movie I was actually tuned into before it even came out, and that is for a compounded reason. Something I haven't talked about, I don't think, at any point on the channel before, is I'm actually quite a big wrestling fan. I don't keep up with it as much as I used to, and being a wrestling fan is a complicated business, so take that all with a grain of salt. I'm not going to get all into that in this video, but yeah. So, if you are a wrestling fan, you've probably heard of the Von Erich family before, either directly or indirectly. And if you're not a wrestling fan, you probably haven't. So, the wrestling industry is fairly niche. Even now, in current year, it's probably bigger than it's ever been. And it's grown dramatically, even just in the time that I've been a viewer. Now, the entire history of wrestling is wacky, to say the least. And it starts out a long time ago, but it really has its growth period during the 70s and 80s, I would say, when it goes from being a lot of fairly small-time promotions, local places that were either not televised or only televised in a small region. And the way the industry worked at that time was very different than how it works now, when these are massive multi-million-dollar productions all the time. So, wrestling has evolved a lot in a fairly short amount of time, but ultimately, the wrestling industry still in many ways looks a lot like it did. It's also full of a lot of families of wrestlers who various people within a family, descendants of people who were wrestlers, etc., are often the people who end up being the new faces in wrestling. It's a little less true now than it was 20 years ago, but the point remains. Because even now, I believe there are, well, I don't know if they're still active. There are 3 Von Erichs right now, or in the last recent past, that have been in wrestling that I know of. And there are lots of other families throughout professional wrestling that are still extremely prolific. Some of them with dozens of people within various promotions, etc. However, in addition to there being a lot of families, wrestling is full of a lot of tragedy. It's easy to be a casual viewer, especially when these things are highly televised and you know, they put on a very shiny facade. But even these days, even with the kinds of regulations and visibility that some of these promotions, very large promotions, have, this is still an industry that is filled with a lot of tragedy. And it looks a little different today than it did back in the 80s and 90s, but there's still a lot of the same things going on. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on why exactly this happens, but a lot of it comes down to the locations and the economic circumstances of people who end up or have ended up in wrestling. And the Von Erichs are no exception to that. I'm not going to delve too much more into that, other than to say that, like, desperation is a pretty powerful motivator. And when you are selling your athleticism to make $1, and it's not a lot of dollars, that's a big deal. And it's still true today. a lot of the issues with the wrestling industry are come down to people not getting paid what they probably should be. Anyway, before I get too far into the weeds on that, let's talk about this movie. Part of the reason I didn't really want to watch this for a long time, even though I was very interested in it, is that it is a story of tragedy. Pretty substantial tragedy. And it's even after it came out, and it got a lot of very good press about it, including a lot of good press from people who were not in any way familiar with wrestling as an industry. I was desperately curious, but not really ready. And I'm not sure, as I've talked about before, with heavy drama and, heavy subjects, sometimes you're just not going to be ready and just going to have to watch it. And I'm glad that I finally did, because this movie is pretty extraordinary. Now, there have been a lot of wrestling movies over the years, some that have been a few that have been quite good, and a lot that have been pretty mediocre, to the point of just straight up lying sometimes, very aggressively. And there have also been a lot of movies that include a lot of current professional wrestlers. We get into all of that discussion as a separate thing, and why The Rock is as big of a movie star as he is. That's a whole other discussion. So let's avoid that for a moment. I am very impressed with this movie for a whole lot of reasons, but not the least of which is taking a very honest look in basically a biopic format at an industry and at a family that is full of a lot of tragedy and sadness, and still managing to make a very compelling movie that is not just miserable to watch. That was ultimately my concern, was that it was going to either put too much of a shine on things or be far too dour. And to their credit, they cut down the story of like 20 years of this family's life, to a more digestible and approachable format. And that is to say that some of the details of what happened to this family are even worse than what is portrayed in this film. Whole characters, and by that I mean people, who don't exist in the film, who had other horrible things happen to them as well. So at the very low level, great adaptation from a very complex and sad story or set of stories, to something that is both respectful and also captures with what seems like a great amount of honesty, emotional honesty and honesty and perspective, even if there's a lot that's cut or adjusted in terms of actual accuracy to history. This is pretty extraordinary in a lot of ways. I'm not familiar with this writer-director, who I understand has had a couple of other very well-regarded but very niche films. I don't remember what they were, but I haven't seen either of them before. I think there were two. Anyway, but I'm very impressed both in the writing and the directing that's going on here. I was actually expecting to see potentially a bigger name on this, purely based on very good direction and very good cinematography that happens throughout this film. The one kind of overarching bother I have with it's not even the cinematography, it's the editing, is that it does have some not entirely horrible but relatively aggressive color grading that is sort of nodding towards the era. Actually, weirdly, it makes the whole thing look older, seem older than it is. I think that's a kind of color grading that it's weird to think that this movie, oh God, I feel old now. It's weird to think that this movie is portraying events that happened mostly in the like mid to late 80s, I think, which was not that long ago. But it's using the kind of color grading that, oh no, I don't want to do math, that movies 20 years ago would use to portray things that happened in the 50s. That's safe, right? Right? Like that is a sliding scale. Okay, yeah. Because it should be more appropriate for something from the 70s. Okay. All right. I'm not crazy. I'm not that old. But the color grading does bother me a little bit. Overall, though, I think that the directing and the cinematography is quite good, and the writing is really excellent. This movie has both fantastic dialogue writing, and it is, I don't want to say dialogue heavy. It is a lot of talking, though. But at the same, like for a sports movie, or for for a sports movie, you'd expect there to be a lot of sports, or more. You'd probably expect there to be more sports than there are in this film. It's much more of a biopic than it is a sports movie, more of a character study in many ways, and an ensemble character study than it is a sports movie. And I think that works to excellent effect, because if you're trying to tell the story of this family and their ups and downs and their successes and tragedies, focusing on the characters is obviously going to be number one. Even if you wanted to tell a more sports-oriented story, I think it would be a mistake not to spend a lot of time characterizing the people. If you want them to be, you want the viewers to be very attached to what happens to these characters. And this movie does that in spades. The characters are written extremely well. They have very believable, quality writing, banter between each other. Their relationships are very, very clearly laid out, but also have a great amount of subtlety. At the same time, this movie has incredible pacing. It looks a little long. It's over 2 hours, but it moves at a very reasonable pace. And at the same time, is very careful and considerate in using substantial stretches with no dialogue and no action, to let the visuals and the acting tell the story of what's going on. Tell the story of the characters and what they're going through. To that point, I think that the casting is largely extremely good. If you told me 15 years ago that I was going to be incredibly impressed with Zac Efron as a dramatic actor, I would have laughed. But that was also 15 years ago, and it's been a long time since then. And he's done a lot more things, and he has come a long way. This was an incredible performance by him in particular, and in a lot of ways, he is sort of the lead for this cast. But it is a broadcast, and the entire family is represented as a character of its own in a sense. So in addition to Zac Efron, most of the family I was very impressed with. Jeremy Allen White, who I think people know from The Bear mostly these days, is incredible. I think the other brothers are also really good. Pretty much everybody on the list puts on a great performance. There are a couple of exceptions, though. Some of them kind of unremarkable, some more so. One is Doris von Erich, who has a very limited screen time, and so it's not that bothersome. I just was not super compelled by her in a lot of ways. She's a little bit overly stoic, and maybe it's because she doesn't have enough screen time to have that emotional development. There's clear reasons why she holds herself the way she does, but like, I just wasn't totally, she didn't totally fill the role that I felt like she needed to fill in this setting. And part of that's down to writing and pacing as well. If you don't have enough lines, there's only so much you can do. Another is, it's only there for one scene, but they're the actor that portrays Ric Flair. This is a personal bother for me and for other wrestling fans probably, if only because Ric Flair is such a character. This is a wrestler who's famous to this day, one of the probably the biggest names ever in wrestling over decades and decades. And he has such a specific, for want of a better word, flair to his behavior, the way he pronounces things, all these other things, the way he holds himself, that getting it wrong, I don't know. This is one of those sort of up and down things that I think I've talked about before, where maybe you don't want to have somebody who's just trying to do an imitation, but also I just wasn't, I didn't love it. The Ric Flair is so specific a character that to get his mannerisms as sort of off as they are, I just would have sort of liked to see somebody who did a better Flair imitation, to be totally honest. Yeah. So that was sort of a minor one. It's only in one scene. And then the final one that bothered me, unfortunately, is the father, Fritz von Erich, who is portrayed by an actor whose name I didn't know, Holt McCallany. And he's an actor I've seen in a lot of stuff, mostly in more minor roles. And he's kind of typecast in a lot of the things I've seen him in. I don't think he's a bad actor per se, and I think he could have done this role justice. And I think in a lot of ways he does, but there are a couple of things that bothered me about his performance. In particular, his very wildly varying accent. Now, a bunch of the actors in here have accents that go up and down throughout the course of the film. This family is located in Texas. Texas has a variety of accents, and it has a variety of weight of accent. So you don't have to do a lot, but it bothered me in particular because his accent was just so inconsistent. And there were certain line reads that were just like, this feels like you're doing your... they were overly enunciated and had no accent to them. And it was just like, this feels like you're reading the script. And it just kind of took me out of what was otherwise a very immersive experience. Like I said, I don't think he's horrible or anything. It just, in a movie that is otherwise largely so extraordinary, it took me out of it in a way that bothered me more than it would have in a less good film, basically. But yeah, those are generally fairly minor issues that I have with this. Like I said already, I think the pacing and the tone does an admirable job. It's very willing to take long beats to let the emotional weight of the experiences that the characters are having set in. It's also very good at balancing elements of like levity and humor and other non-tragic drama in a story that is still being told even in its writing as a fundamentally tragic story. The I was going to talk about the details of what happened to the family or what the whole background is here, but I'm not even going to get into that. I think it's worth just, especially if you're not familiar with it, just going into it blind. That said, if you do know the stories behind several of the members of the family, it can be extra harrowing to see the elements that are set up very early. They do an admirable job of giving you an idea of these characters fairly early on and the types of things that are their strengths and weaknesses and how those will influence the things that will happen later in their lives. Oh man, this movie takes an emotional toll. It's very heavy, and not just because of the subject matter. This is some of the best sort of interpersonal acting I think I've seen in a long time. And there aren't a huge amount of movies that portray entire families in such a way. So I don't have a lot of like points of reference, but man, does this feel like a family, for better or for worse. Because they're not, one big, perfect, happy family all the time. But that's sort of the whole narrative, is about a family that is struggling within itself and outside of itself. And I think this story is told really incredibly well. Does honor to the family members themselves, and I think it does honor to like wrestling as a business and as an occupation as well. I know I'm sort of looping around back to the beginning again, but it's clear. There were a couple of actual pro wrestlers in the film. I found out later. I didn't even recognize any of them in the film. That could have been a very big mistake. Side note, as I mentioned before, putting wrestlers in films is a little bit, or can be a little bit questionable, but especially if it was supposed to be like a nod of some kind, a very overt nod that was like for the fans or something, that would have been completely shattering of the immersion. So I'm glad that both they had some wrestlers in here, and they were given some good guidance on wrestling as an industry, clearly. Also, I completely slipped my mind. I don't think that they used, not that, as far as I could tell, there were no or very limited use of stunt doubles in this film. The characters really are in the shape that they're in, as far as I can tell. Zac Efron is like, holy shit, he's built. And they are really, really wrestling, as far as I can tell. They're not, smash cutting all over the place to try and hide the impacts and stuff like that. Like, it's not the best wrestling I've ever seen in my life, but it is extremely well done. And as far as I can tell, they learned the stuff and did it for real. And extra special, appreciation to the actors for putting in that work. Even if it was, very limited actual time in the runtime and they only needed to learn a few things, like, they were doing it and they did a very good job. So yeah, anyway, any other things about the details of this movie? It's just, I'm very impressed in the movie overall, in how it references wrestling, in the direction and the writing and the acting and so many other things. I'm just very impressed, even beyond what what my expectations were and what the sort of things that were being said about it after it came out suggested it was as good as it is. I think, as one last note, if you have no connection or interest in wrestling at all, I still think that does not diminish the value or interest you will have in this film in the least. This is not a film for wrestling fans, which unfortunately it probably didn't. It performed pretty well, all things considered, but still does niche film numbers. It's also produced by A24, which, means it's niche to begin with, but probably didn't get as much viewership as it did because people assumed it was a wrestling film. And this is much more compelling than just a wrestling film. It even goes to the point of very carefully and subtly teaching you everything you need to know for the context, for all of the context necessary to understand wrestling in general and this particular time and place where wrestling was growing. And even that is also an extraordinarily necessary thing to do, but also something that could have been done a lot more ham-fistedly. I think this is incredibly compelling and comprehensible, understandable for somebody who has no prior knowledge, experience, or interest in wrestling. Anyway, I really, really like this film. I've only finished it a little while ago, but I'm just very impressed. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.